Mario is going to kick off our event, The News Deserts in Our Backyard.
Well, thank you, Brendan. I really appreciate the invitation and allowing us and giving us a space for the work that Scott, myself, and my colleague Ashish have been working on now for the past year. And thanks to everybody. I see some familiar faces that I haven't seen in a while, so it's great to see all of you. So again, thanks to PCLI. There's so many people to thank that made this project possible, but I'll skip that since time is of the essence. But I did want to share a little bit of background on myself because most of you probably don't know me. I know you know Scott very well, has been immersed with PCLI, and I think I definitely really want to get more involved with the work that you guys do, that all of you do at the PCLI. But since you don't know too much about myself, I just want to give you a sense of where I come from. I don't identify as a journalist anymore, although I did for many, many years. I respect too much the craft and the enterprise of journalism to identify as a journalist now. I'm more in the academy, as you all know, but I worked for many, many years as a journalist, particularly in radio and commercial, both commercial, public, community, and now university radio, and mostly in news, in public affairs, in feature reporting. I was a feature reporter for NPR and for Latino USA for many years, the national magazine from NPR. I worked at Pacifica Radio. I worked at WBAI. I worked at 1010 Wins, my first gig, and in fact, I know that's where I know Jeff. One of my first radio reporting gigs was at 1010 Wins many years ago. And of course, now I'm really pleased to be working with the students and the staff at WRHU, our community licensed station at the university. So that's my background. I was brought into Hofstra many years ago to work on the development of the program, the academic program in radio, and particularly in news and journalism radio. And since then, I've researched and I've done a lot of academic research in community media and community journalism and community radio in particular in Latin America, and specifically Colombia, a country that I call my second home, where I spent a lot of time with indigenous communities working on community radio projects, particularly in the south part of the country, that I've written articles and published articles in journals and texts, and have an unfinished manuscript of about 85% done that one day I'll eventually finish. But I've been a faculty member at Hofstra now since about 1998, teaching radio journalism, media studies, Latin American studies, and now for the last few years, I've been serving as vice dean at the Herbert School of Communication alongside Mark Lukashevitz, who's our dean, who started back in 2018. And for some crazy reason, he asked me to serve as his vice dean. And after considerable pause, I decided to take it on. And this project is one of the results of that, because last year, our president, Susan Poser, opened up a kind of a RFP for the entire university to ask for requests for project ideas and research project ideas, particularly initiatives that were related to the community. And so I, as a representative of the Herbert School of the School of Communication, pushed forward this idea of something that's always been on my mind, because we've done other work in the past at Hofstra with community organizations and media, both in radio, video, capacity building, all sorts of different community engagement projects from the Herbert School. And I thought that it would be a good thing to possibly look into this concept of the news deserts and the news ecosystem, or the media ecosystem, in the community surrounding Hofstra University. And that project was approved, and I could not think of two better people to work on that project with me on than, of course, Ashish Kumar. Again, some of you might know Ashish, who's currently in India working on another project, so he couldn't join us. And of course, Scott Brinton, who's been at the forefront of this project as well. And it's been a pleasure working with Scott on these last, now over a year now that we've been working on it. So I'm just going to give a really quick move forward. I don't have control of the PowerPoint. So Scott, if you can just kind of jump forward to the next one. These are just the titles. And again, these are preliminary findings. Our thinking is that this is an ongoing project and ongoing work that perhaps might lead down the road to some interesting collaborations. But essentially, the two primary objectives of the project related to one, to try to understand the media landscape in the neighboring communities surrounding Hofstra, right? Especially among underrepresented communities in the area, but really trying to get a sense of, to get a sense of the communities themselves. So we did a mapping of the community-based organizations. We looked at the media mapping. We did a media mapping to get a sense of what were the media out there that have been serving the community over the years and in a particular area. And then most important, I think, or another very important component of it was the media kind of review, the look at the local area, what has been the coverage. So it's a news audit, if we can call it that. So that's those are the main primary objectives. The first main objective, but the second main objective is to think about and to contemplate future collaborative initiatives that we might be able to do, like that are happening all over the country in similar spaces, right? And I'm not only talking about collaboration between Hofstra University media organizations, Hofstra University students with community organizations, but also potentially other media. And we're seeing a lot of examples of that, given the crisis that we've seen in these news deserts that have popped up all over the country. We see a lot of collaborations between universities, professional journalism, professional media, and community in telling stories and re-engaging and finding different ways to fill these voids that we see in Long Island, but also obviously around the country. So that was sort of the thinking of it. If we did a considerable amount of literature review, and I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with a lot of the reports that have come out from a lot of different institutions and organizations that have been studying the problem of news deserts. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but that's what we're kind of presenting, because there's so much written about it. But essentially, we can say that there are three issues that have come up again and again in all the literature that we went through and that we reviewed in preparation for this project. One, of course, is the ongoing issue of the so-called deterioration of the public sphere, if you will, the deterioration of civic dialogue that is the result of the closure of newspapers, the closure of media outlets, reduced coverage, particularly in suburban and in rural areas, but we also see it in urban areas as well. So that's something that we see in a lot of the literature. A second is this idea of the growing distrust of the mass media that has a lot of different causes and reasons for it. But this is something that we see a lot. A lot of it has to do with the polarization of the national mass media, obviously the emphasis on, right, left, et cetera, and also the political discourse that denounces journalism as the enemy of the people, and that kind of language that has in many ways created this distrust of mass media. And then the third, I think, is something that we've seen for years. It's not anything new by any stretch, but the ongoing misrepresentation, particularly of communities of color and marginalized communities, we see again and again in a lot of the studies that have come out that kind of prepped us and kind of framed a lot of the approach that we took in moving this forward. So, God, again, I'm sorry.
Yep.
And so, okay, so we reviewed a lot of the issues of the problem of the news deserts, which again we'll go through quickly. Scott, does it move forward? Yeah. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this aspect because all of you know this most likely. I mean, this is you guys have been living this issue of the so-called digital downfall, the circulation drops in journalism, local journalism that we've seen certainly in the last 20 years, declines in circulation, the job losses in newsrooms. This statistic is pretty kind of disturbing when we see the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics says that newsroom staffs in the last 19-20 years have dropped, from 71 almost 72,000 to 30,000, and that number probably is continuing to drop. The closing of newspapers and other local media. You've all continue to live that on a daily basis, so we don't need to spend too much time on it. In another presentation, we do get in more detail on that. But one of the things that it definitely influenced me in the proposal and the development of the proposal for the project was that in many ways, this news desert phenomenon that we're focusing on a lot, and more institutions and academics and journalists and community organizations are looking at this news deserts, that in many ways, particularly in Black and Latino and communities, marginalized communities, poor communities, those information gaps have always existed. We've seen that in a lot of the literature and in some of the material that we went over before getting into the study. We saw this point that lower income communities are dramatically underserved relative to wealthier communities in the news media. An analysis of news stories in 100 communities across the US found the greater the proportion of a community population that is quote unquote Hispanic or Latino, the less robust is the journalism in that community. And we see a lot of different reports coming from from the American Society of Newspaper Editors, from NAHJ, NABJ, AAJA. All the different organizations have put studies with similar results based on their analysis of the trends that we've seen in recent years. But one of the things that attracted me, and I think to the project, one of the things that we kind of were guided by was this third point, which is highlighted in yellow, that comes out of a study by Heather Bryant. It's a report study called A Roadmap for Equitable Inclusion, looking at journalism as a process and really trying to find other ways, new ways to tell stories and cover these communities that have witnessed and have experienced these news gaps, information gaps for many years. And that's this idea of when the least empowered people are given the agency of partnership, rather than the marginalization of being objects, the journalism producer is more likely to realize the goals of accountability and the best opportunity for a more nuanced and accurate depiction of reality. Now, this is probably a good subject of discussion later, and in fact, that's what we'll get to this a little bit later. But I think this was in many ways what was guiding the approach that we were taking and considering the potentiality of future collaborations. So essentially, there's many different ways of defining the news desert, again, based on the literature. This we take out of perhaps one of the most important projects coming nationally is from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, their project, The Expanding News Desert. They refer to it as a community, either rural or urban, with limited access to the sort of credible and comprehensive news and information that feeds democracy at the grassroots level. So again, this is something that most of you are probably familiar with. And I think if we just jump forward to the next couple, quickly talk about what our thinking was in terms of how we approached the project, how we approached the project. And then I'll throw it to describe, some of the essentials that came out of it, particularly with the news audit. So if we look at the communities that we decided on looking at, because obviously Nassau County is huge. If we look at Long Island in general, it's huge. The two different counties, lots of different contexts and economic and social experiences, et cetera. We decided to take Freeport, Hempstead, Elmont, Roosevelt, Uniondale, and Westbury as our kind of the case studies, if you will. One of the reasons why we took that is the first one. If you look at these towns, they're atypical in terms of their racial demographic breakdown, economically they're different, as well as linguistically, to the larger Nassau County framework, if you will. And again, in the interest of time, I won't show you the demographic data that we have, and that we could show how these 6 towns are different than Nassau County in general. So that was one of the reasons that we chose these towns. It was also an opportunity to study the communities, the hyperlocal news in the local community that surround Hofstra. Right, these are generally the closest villages and towns that surround Hofstra. But what it ultimately allows us to question and to think about, and certainly leaves room for future studies, is that how would it be? How would these results appear if we looked at Garden City, or if we looked at Glen Cove, or if we looked at some of the Manhasset, or some of the other neighborhoods and towns in Long Island that are much more well-to-do, that are much more predominantly white, less demographically, culturally diverse, etc. What kind of results would we see if we took those into consideration? So that this is more or less the contours of the communities that we looked at. And if we can just jump forward, I'll talk a little briefly about the methodology, and then I'll throw it to Scott. So the methodology, these are the basic approaches that we took. We did online surveys. The online surveys were directed both to community-based organizations in these towns, and we sent out dozens and dozens. And again, I don't have the slides which talks about how many responses we have, but we got considerable response, particularly from Uniondale, Hempstead, Freeport as well. So we did the online surveys. We also did online surveys, by the way, with the journalists and the journalism organizations. We also welcomed people into Hofstra, and we did several sets of focus groups with the community-based organizations. And subsequent to the focus groups, we did exit surveys, asking them to answer certain series of questions. And with the community organizations, we also did a brainstorming conversation, which was focused more on potential collaborations in the future and what their needs are in terms of addressing their needs in terms of communication. So that was more or less in terms of the community-based organizations. Scott is going to talk more about how those and then of course the last component of it was the news audit that looked at the news reporting from January 1st to June 30th of 2022 in these 6 communities, which again, Scott is going to point to and share more time on. And I think the last thing just to share, just to get a sense. So again, some of this may be new to you, maybe not. We asked the community organizations about how they use media, how they engage and interact with local media. How do they get their information out to the community using the media and working with the media? And they talked about the different kinds of communication tools they use: social media, emails, direct phone calls, direct connection, what kind of media they're depending on. And then we asked them to reflect on their perception of how local news is being reported on, what kind of local news and information is available to the community and to their constituents. Those are the kinds of questions we were asking to get their sense of what it was like. And Scott, I guess we can jump to the last. I think there's just 2 more slides which give you a quick sense. And again, we have dozens of these kind of excerpts from the responses. So one of the questions that we asked to the CBOs was, has your organization sought coverage, or have media organizations reached out to you in the past 6 months? So 6 months to 1 year period, this previous time period. And so this is a reflection of many of the thinking, the way of the communities are thinking. We're being reached out to for comment, or we're getting reached out to for a statistic or some sort of a metric. They're looking to get a number from us as part of something that they're doing. So it's part of their agenda, not necessarily ours. Essentially saying that, when we are trying to get attention, we generally don't get attention. We don't get coverage. We don't get coverage of the stories that are important to us. We're generally kind of a springboard, really, for when the news media are responding to certain kinds of stories that occur. And then the second, and again, there's many others, but in the interest of time, we won't share that. The other question that we were asking, and we framed it in several different ways, but in synthesis, do you encounter misrepresentation and or disinformation about your community in the media? How could this be improved? And this was one of the many responses we got around this question. All you ever hear about is crime and poverty and everything negative that they dig up about their neighborhoods, which makes it extremely hard for them to work within their communities. The need to work to address these misconceptions, to try to change them from the ground up, because otherwise we have a very hard time bringing any change in our communities. So there is this feeling of kind of not being listened to, not being heard generally. And again, it was reflected in many different responses from some of the participants. And again, forgive me, I'm rushing through this because there's a lot more of these kinds of responses that we can share, but it was really in the interest of getting to the point of where Scott will take over to look at how we approach the news media, and particularly the news audit as we reviewed the coverage of the last 6 months, or the first 6 months of last year. Now we're talking about a year ago. So Scott, why don't you take it from there?
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Mario. So the first thing we wanted to talk about and kind of dispel a notion that a news desert is an empty space. There are empty spaces across the country where there is no news, and that's generally what folks think about when they think about a news desert. It's just an empty space where there is no sort of local media, local news. And what we found in our research, and we sort of coined this phrase here, where there are actually two types of news deserts. One where there's just an empty space where there is no availability, and the other is an area of desert where there is some vegetation, as you can see from the example that we have here, the two deserts that we have here, the Sahara versus the Sonoran Desert, where there is some type of vegetation that might sustain the local community to one degree or another, but you still can't live within this environment. It's not an enriching environment that we would hope for within a solid working media ecosystem. So the question that we were really asking throughout our research, is it possible to live within a suburban area like Long Island, where there is lots of access to media markets and to media, but still live within a news desert? So we took a look, at the various media, and the media that we studied, where there are, by the way, 43 community-based weekly newspapers in Nassau County. There's one large Long Island-based regional daily newspaper. That's, of course, Newsday. 3 metropolitan daily newspapers, New York Times, New York Post, Daily News. There are local affiliates of ABC, NBC, CBS. There's News 12, of course, 2 major metropolitan news stations, and 2 local news radio stations. So is it possible with this media saturation to live within a news desert? And I think you'll find that when we come to the end of our presentation, you'll conclude that at least for the 6 communities that we studied, the answer is yes, to varying degrees. Okay, so what did we do? We also, in addition to working with the CBOs, the community-based organizations in the 6 communities that we studied, we also sat down with the journalists. This was in a Zoom session. We had journalists from various media who we also sent out surveys to, and also worked with them in doing interviews, online interviews. And we worked with Newsday, Herald community newspapers, that is the Elmont Herald and the Freeport Herald, Anton newspapers, we looked at what was the Westbury Times and is now Nassau Illustrated. We had representatives from WCBS News Radio, News 12 Long Island, the Daily Mail, WABC TV Eyewitness News, WIW, and WNBC TV. So those are the folks who participated in our news media focus group. And that was back last June. Okay. Now, I want to begin with this point. What are the constraints of your particular medium that may impact on how you report? Now, it's important for us to note that as we go through the news audit portion of our presentation and take a look at what exactly was covered, this is not in any way a condemnation of any sort of the coverage that's out there. It's really to say, okay, this is, in a very objective way, this is the news coverage that's out there, but it's certainly not a condemnation, and in part because we know how strained news reporters are. So these are just some of the responses that we received, either in their surveys or in discussing with us. So having the resources to do the work that we all want to do is the great challenge always. This is a public television news executive. On Long Island, we have 124 school districts, many superintendents, many workers, businesses. I mean, it's just a lot to cover. And that's a daily editor. Okay. And these are from the weekly editors. I have a feeling I've disappointed many people. I get almost on a weekly basis calls, emails, texts, people asking, begging, pleading with me to look into something or other. I just don't have the bandwidth. And then finally, I wish I could split myself like the sorcerer's apprentice and send myself all over Hempstead. So we see to a high degree a sense of frustration among journalists about a lack of resources. Now, that being said, we asked journalists to guesstimate or to estimate how many stories they felt they were producing individually within the coverage areas on a weekly basis. And we received 9 responses in our surveys, among our surveys. The top 2, more than 7 and 5 to 7, nobody in that category after completing the news audit actually fell within either of those 2 frames. The third, 3 to 5, there were a handful of the weekly editors who fell within that frame. And then the others, 1 to 2, 1 to 3 was more like it, or in the case of the daily and regional publications and news outlets, that was more the case. It was usually 0 on a week-to-week basis. Now, this was an interesting question. We wanted to look at and understand like how journalists are actually interacting with their community and the folks in the communities, certainly with the CBOs, but just regular folks on the street as well. So we asked them how they were actually communicating and what was their preferred means of communication. And this came as somewhat as a surprise, although maybe not. 50% of the journalists, and we had 14 responses, said that email was their preferred means of communication. So what does that mean? That means they're not on the street. It means they're not out in the community, and certainly not within these communities, interacting in sort of that traditional journalism mode where you go to your source. I mean, that's what I was always told as a young journalist. That's what I've always told my students at Hofstra, you go to your source. But apparently email is a preferred means of communication, at least among the journalists that we worked with and studied. Other forms of communication included social media, not to any great degree. No one really said social media. 22% said phone. So if you take phone and email, more than, nearly 3/4 of the journalists aren't out on the street, so to speak, interacting with sources within their own communities. Okay. Now, this is another research in question. How often do you interact with sources from within one of the assigned coverage areas? There was definitely a split between more of the regional news organizations and the community news organizations, which certainly one would expect. Among the regional news organizations, the answers range from 1 to 3. One said, twice a week, more than 3 times a week. One said, among the community organizations, of the 6, one said occasionally, one said twice a week, and then 3 said more than 3 times a week, which was, of course, what you would expect. Now, we undertook what we believe to be the only news audit of its kind in the research. We looked at many studies, dozens and dozens of studies, read several books, took a look and wanted to see, have any other researchers done this kind of news audit where they looked at every single story that appeared within the publications surrounding certain media ecosystems within a confined period. And we couldn't find any. There weren't any so far. Now, that's not to say they don't exist, such studies, but we're pretty sure that it doesn't exist. In fact, in 2015, the Knight Foundation did a study, and they said that there was no systematic study that had ever been done in such a way. So we believe this might be the first one. We looked at all of these news outlets in our news audit: Anton newspapers, Daily News, Herald, New York Times, Newsday, News 12, Daily Mail, Long Island Press, New York Post, New York Times, WABC, WCBS, radio, and WNBC. We looked at all of them and studied them through a lot of systematic advanced searching, which we'll talk about in a second. But anyway, so these are the news outlets that we studied, and we wanted to look at every single and find every single news story that was covered. I think we accomplished that goal. So now, what did we find? Within the news audit, there were at least 458 stories that were produced during this period among the examined news organizations within those 6 coverage areas, within those 6 communities. The stories were found in databases such as Newsbank and Newsday Recent, and through advanced Google site Boolean searches of each of the news organizations or website searches. So we, if we couldn't find a story, we went directly to the website, did a search. We also took a look at paper copies of newspapers. We took a look, and there was a lot of sifting, hundreds of hours of work. We began that part of our study last June and just concluded it a couple of weeks ago in December. And every story was coded according to an issue or a topic: education, crime, politics, and so forth. Every story was then input into an Excel spreadsheet. We have 4 separate Excel spreadsheets. And then, of course, we did all sorts of calculations to take a look, and I'll show you where that all came out. But everything was cataloged. So we have a comprehensive list of all 458 stories. That includes the headline, the date of publication, and then, of course, the code, how we coded it, and, of course, the news organization. So this is what we found. Oops. So within the news stories, within the 6 coverage areas, or the 6 communities, we broke it down into 3 parts. So there are aggregated news organizations. Now, the aggregated news organizations include News 12, WABC, WNBC, CBS, Daily Mail, Long Island Press, New York Times, Daily News, New York Post, WCBS, Westbury. Now, why did we do it that way? We aggregated all of those because they didn't really have enough news stories within any one given community to really justify having them as part of their own category. And among all of those different news organizations, they had 114 stories that were produced during that period. Newsday total among all 6 of the communities had 140 stories, and then Herald Community Newspapers, which includes only 2 communities, Elmont and Freeport, had 204 stories. Now, as a journalist and a media researcher, this shows to me a couple of things. One, just the importance of community media. That when a community, there is a vibrant community media within a coverage area, you're going to see a much greater production of stories than if there isn't. So that's one. We'll talk about the other reasons why it's so important. Oh, look, a typo. Whoops, you didn't see that. Okay, now, so the question of the assertion of media misrepresentation. Now, it's important to note that within any given coverage area, there was or was not necessarily media misrepresentation. And what did our sources, our CBOs, tell us about media misrepresentation? What they were saying essentially is this, and what we heard again and again in the multiple interviews that we did, because with the CBOs, we did more than one session of interviews. And in survey after survey, they said this, that crime predominates the coverage, that essentially they're being misrepresented because there's so much else that's going on in any one of these communities, but all that gets covered is crime. So when you have, again, that vibrant, and I should note here, most of you know this, I was formerly executive editor of Herald Community Newspapers. I was not executive editor during the period of time when we were conducting this media study. So I had left and I became a full-time professor at Hofstra at that point. Now, but in terms of, so we took a look and said, what percentage of crime, is the coverage? What percentage of the coverage, rather, is crime? So for the Freeport Herald, during those 6 months, it constituted 3% of the coverage, which is about a good number, what you would probably expect. For the Elmont Herald, it was about 7%. So in no way could you say that within these 2 particular publications did it dominate the coverage. Now, when you go to Newsday, it changes a bit. And here you start to see crime beginning to dominate the coverage, but not to any degree. It was not the majority of the coverage within Newsday, not in any one of the communities. It came close in Hempstead, but it was not the majority of coverage. Overall, Newsday, about 1 in 4 stories were crime-related stories. Hempstead, close to 1 in 2, but in Uniondale, 1 in 3, Freeport, 1 in 4, and then you go to Roosevelt, it's as few as 1 in 10. So very different picture there for Newsday than the Herald, but still not, again, a majority of the coverage. Now, here's where I think the misrepresentation comes in, at least from the perspective of those community leaders that we were speaking to. When we looked at the other aggregated news media, that includes, again, News 12, Eyewitness News, WNBC, WCBS, et cetera. We took a look and said, okay, how much of the coverage was actually crime-related? So when you take a look at Uniondale, I'm not sure if you can see that on the screen, but Uniondale was 73% of the coverage among these news organizations was crime. And it was usually the most sensational crime. So when you take a look at, 73% of the coverage, and a lot of this coverage is magnified throughout the day because it's repeated on a continuous cycle. So a News 12, the stories with these crime stories were often repeated throughout the day, throughout a 12-hour news cycle. And then you end the 12-hour news cycle with a WABC, WNBC, and WCBS all covering the same crime story. If you go and take a look at our actual audit documents, you'll see that many of the same stories were magnified over and over again by having these large media. Hempstead, 62% of the coverage was crime-related. Elmont, 60%. And then Roosevelt and Freeport, 25%. Now, Roosevelt and Freeport received the least amount of coverage among any of our any of the communities that were covered. Okay, so that's really kind of the comparison there between your community media. You're starting out with the community media, moving to a regional daily like Newsday, and then going to these very large regional news outlets that are much more crime focused. Again, I think that illustrates, to my mind at least, the importance of having vibrant community-based media, because they bring context to the rest of the community. They provide an alternative to a lot of this very crime cover, this type of crime coverage. And there's a wonderful book out. It's a depressing book, but it's a wonderful book. The Death of Daily News. It's about not the Daily News here in New York, but the Daily News in Pennsylvania. And it talks about a community in Pennsylvania, just outside of Pittsburgh, that lost its newspaper, its only newspaper, and its really only local news outlet. And what happened to the community in the days and months and years after it lost its only community outlet. And it became a place where essentially regional newspapers, large regional news outlets were covering the community, but only covering crime. And so this one community became essentially known as a murder capital of the region, simply because that's all that got covered. But once upon a time, there was a daily newspaper there that covered the community in a much more vigorous way and provided the type of context that would show that, no, this is not necessarily murder capital. But one would be left with that impression given the regional news coverage. Okay, now, this is really what was and wasn't covered. So looking at all the news media outside of crime coverage, we took a look and coded for all these different types of stories. Education, outside of crime, education dominated the rest of the coverage. It doesn't even come, any of the other categories don't even really come close. Now, these are categories that we looked at and said at the very beginning of our study, we want to code for these because we want to see to what degree are the issues that are important to these communities actually being covered. The only one that's really being covered is education. And it's important to note that a lot of those education stories were found within the community newspapers, meaning Elmont Herald and the Freeport Herald. But that's not to say that education wasn't covered in other news outlets. I should say that Newsday did a pretty fine job of covering education. That was a big part of their coverage, as well as with News 12. There was quite a bit of education there as well. Let's see. Okay.
It should be pointed out, Scott, quickly that part of the reason why these are the issues or areas, not only are there many and broad, but a lot of the organizations, CBOs that responded to our survey and participated in the work we were doing represent organizations dealing with all of these issues.
Yes,
So
these are the central issues that our CBOs really are leaders in. Now, obviously there are important statistics within here. I'll just point out one: immigration. Within those 6 communities, we took a look and noted, the immigrant populations within those communities, and they ranged, foreign-born population ranged anywhere from 25 to as much as 40% of the community. And yet, among all 458 stories, only 2 were on immigration. So obviously we as a media have a lot of work to do in order to try to cover the types of stories that matter. And again, this cuts to the idea of a news desert. If we as journalists aren't covering the issues that people need to hear in order to make good decisions in a democratic society, going back to that University of North Carolina definition, then are we doing our jobs? And that's a big question that we need to be asking ourselves. Okay, and then Mario, you're up.
Well, this is both really, and this is just to kind of wrap up, and I see that we're running out of time. So again, we recognize the landscape currently of the news media is a challenge. Let's call it a challenge for democracy. Some people refer to it as a crisis. And so we as an academic institution are wondering, well, are we in a position to perhaps play at least a little role in responding to that crisis? So that's one of the things that led to this study, and in many ways the question that we're asking all of you and others as we move this forward. We got a sense of what the community-based organizations are thinking and how they're feeling. Obviously, we can do a lot more. I think there's room for engagement with many more communities, including some of the towns that we included in our study that we weren't able to reach out to. So I think that's another area that needs to be looked at. My hunch is that a lot of those same communities are going to feel the same way. But again, that's something that we should probably look at. And then we looked at the news sources. We met with different journalists and participated. We did the audit of the news that Scott just pointed out. We can continue doing that. We can look further. The other question that we didn't really ask is, does the fact that a lot of these organizations now have access to their own media channels through social media, through Facebook, through Instagram, and otherwise, does that minimize the impact of not having local coverage of their stories? Or in other words, are they able to tell their own stories without the gatekeeper of the news media? That's the question that we didn't ask in our approach, although a lot of the community-based organizations pointed out that they're not so successful in engaging communities using social media as of yet. So that's something that we could look at in a future study. I don't know if we could move forward to the next one.
You want to wrap it up now, just because we got about
I think so. I mean,
I think
that's pretty good to just.
I think we're good. All right, so I'm going to just stop screen sharing, and then Brendan, if folks have questions or comments, happy to answer them.
I'll kick us off with a question, Scott. And I'm, this was touched on in the presentation a bit, but we were talking earlier today about the fact that a saying in journalism is, if it bleeds, it leads. And it kind of refers to the fact that crime, fires, tragedy, accidents tend to get the most attention. And it goes to explain why, when you have a crime, all of these organizations jump in on it to report it, even though, you know, the other 29 days of the month when there wasn't a big crime, it's just the local newspaper that gives that community any attention. And is there a way to get past that? Because I don't really expect that regional organizations or national organizations are going to just stop giving that much attention to those if it bleeds stories.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to note, again, to me, this goes back to the importance of community media, because community media provide context within a community. Now, it's also important to note that in our study, we found definitely a different treatment of Black and brown communities than we did of white communities, in terms of any kind of coverage, in terms of crime coverage and so forth. But I'll give you even just one very quick example. So last June, there was legislation that, you know, around gun control that, or a gun control measure that, I should say, that Governor Kathy Hochul was proposing. So all the media did stories about gun control. Now, New York Times did a story, New York Post did a story, Daily News did a story. And within the context of those stories, New York Times went to Uniondale and interviewed a Uniondale gun shop owner, and then used a photo of a Hempstead gun shop. New York Post also used a photo of a local gun shop within Hempstead and Uniondale. Now, I found it very curious that New York Post would use that photo of a Uniondale gun shop or a Hempstead gun shop when the story had nothing to do with Long Island and was in fact about Eric Adams talking about gun control. So why did they choose a particular Black and brown community here on Long Island to talk about something that was happening in New York City? That was strange. And why did the New York Times select it? We took a look at how many gun shops there are actually in New York State. There's 1,750 gun shops in New York State, and yet two of the major daily regional newspapers chose the only, one of the very few Black and brown communities here on Long Island to illustrate their story on gun control, which sort of gives this sense that there are a lot of guns in these communities. So there's definitely, that's just a very quick example. I mean, there are many others that will come out in the written form of the study when we actually come out with the study. But that's just one quick example of sort of a differential treatment that Black and brown communities like Uniondale, Hempstead, and others receive compared to the other white communities. I mean, there are gun shops in Rockville Center, there's a gun shop in Merrick. They're nearby white communities, and yet they're not chosen for sourcing and for photos.
I think Peter has a question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, is this a new phenomenon, or has this always been the case that there are areas, that the communities haven't been covered? I mean, when you talk about news desert, I sort of have the feeling, well, this is something that has developed recently with the decline of newspapers. But has it always been the case that the communities have never been covered as thoroughly as they might have been? Or was there a time when they did more coverage and now it's shrunk?
Well, that was sort of my point. That was sort of my point in my preamble, and it was based on a lot of the literature. But I could just talk about lived experience. Right now, I'm reading this book called The Sound of Exclusion, NPR and the Latinx Public. It's by a scholar, Christopher Chavez. And it writes about how public radio for decades ignored the Latino population public, right? I've been involved with public radio for a long time, better part of my adult life, and always looked at as marginal, right? Like only now do we hear and we see the voices. So that was the point. You're absolutely right, Peter, that a lot of the Black and brown communities that we talked to they felt that this has always been the case. It's not a result of the disappearing of newspapers and the digital revolution that has changed advertising and has created an economic crisis across the board. That's for many of the communities, they've felt that all the time. But what Scott says is that you did have a semblance of I don't know if I want to call it a buffer, but you did have the local presses that were doing some of that work that now are more and more rare. And we're talking about in our area, but if we look at other parts of the country, the same experience is happening. So that's a good point. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I think we need to emphasize, that for many communities, these news deserts have always existed.
Yeah, and I think that I mean, certainly for Black and Brown communities, communities of color, they have always existed here in this country. Of course, there's local press that have filled in those gaps, but there's been a decline in local press. We saw that even take place during the news study. So the Westbury Times was there for a very long time, but it no longer exists. It was merged into two other publications within the Anton, group of newspapers. It's now called NASA Illustrated. So when I went to Westbury Library and took a look at the actual coverage of the Westbury Times, so the Westbury Times existed from January to March and then became the NASA Illustrated, and took a look at those, the Westbury Times. Even when it was the Westbury Times, at that point, they were no longer covering Westbury. So within that 6 months, I found fewer than 10 stories on Westbury within that coverage area. Most of the stories for Westbury, for the publication that was intended for Westbury, were outside of that coverage area, and most of them were North Shore affluent areas that were being covered within the NASA Illustrated. And we also found some stories that were on Uniondale and Hempstead. They were crime stories within the NASA Illustrated, even though the NASA Illustrated is out, it does not cover those communities. So, yeah.
Another question, Maria del Mar Piedrabuena.
This is Gary Louis. For one thing, let me just make an observation. This is an extraordinary study, and I suspect it's unprecedented and should prove to be pretty helpful in navigating the future. I have an observation and then a question. Our agency also does work in other parts of the New York metro area. In Westchester and Gannett, for all intents and purposes, that paper, that outlet is unrecognizable. They no longer welcome opinion pieces, and you can't find editorials in Gannett because I think they believe nobody reads them. And I think that is an indication of the severity of the news desert. I guess my question, though, is going to be, if editors and reporters keep coming back to you and saying, we are scant on resources, if only I had the time, if only I had the staff, what's the business model for news publications, news outlets going forward? Any idea?
Yeah, I mean, this is the ongoing conversation, Gary, that you see everywhere. I mean, if you go to AEJMC, you go to SPJ, you go to International Communication Association, all these academic conferences where you have a mixture of practitioners, professionals in journalism discussing communication and the crises we're seeing in journalism. What do we do about this broken model? Now, if you look at the historical literature going back, and particularly in broadcast, going back to the 20s and 30s, the alarm bells were being sounded by people like us who were saying the commercial model is bound to lead to this kind of crisis in democratic communication. But obviously we know what we got. But now it's just now it's coming to fruition and people are beginning to respond. I'm heartened by the fact that at these academic institution conferences and sessions, now for the last 10 years or so, as I've been attending them for years, but you're seeing more of an acceptance of a need to address the model and the possibility, which in the past was completely anathema to so-called objective professional journalism, of finding collaborations between institutions of higher learning where you have some resources like Hofstra, with professional journalists and with community, so that community participates in the storytelling process. And for me, I'm just speaking on a personal level, having been involved in community media for literally over 30 years, 35 years, I remember I left 1010 Wins in commercial radio because I felt I was participating in this news desert process, and I gravitated towards public and community radio. And we were training people to tell their stories and learn, homeless activists, people with AIDS, immigrant rights folks, immigrants, to tell their own stories. And we were looked at as crazies. We were looked at as, oh, that's not journalism, that's not storytelling. Now it is becoming much more acceptable. I'm not saying, obviously, we still have to look at standards. We still have to go by certain criteria and certain conventions that make journalism what it is and why it's necessary in a democratic society. But now there's more conversation about the possibility of creating new models. I mean, your question is really the answer. We have to look at new models that are not necessarily based on simply thinking of the business model as the only answer. That's my perspective. I'm not sure how others might feel about that.
Well, and the way I'd answer it is this, that, I mean, the last 10 years, we've been so focused on the economic model that we forgot about the journalism model. And I think that the question that this study brings up is, what is the journalism model? Because before you look at the economic model, you have to look at the journalism model. In order for you to build a news organization, you have to have a readership, you have to have a viewership, you have to have a listenership. And the only way to do that is to really address what people's news needs are. Again, I go back to that definition from the University of North Carolina, where they're saying that you're going to be getting the news that you need as an individual to make good decisions in a democratic society. Now, the problem is that if you're in Uniondale and what you see most of the time is crime coverage about your, 75% of the time, you're seeing crime coverage, with the exception of Newsday, which was a little bit better. But, most of the other coverage you see is crime. Then you turn off to the news. You don't care anymore, and you stop listening, you stop reading, and there you've lost the battle. There is no economic model because there's no journalism. And so I think that as news, part of what I hope this study will do is show news executives that you got to stop focusing on crime all the time, because it might bleed for a little while. What leads, what bleeds, leads, that might work for a little while, and that'll get you quick hits, but that will not get you community trust. And in order to build a news model, an economic model, you have to have trust.
And Maria Del Mar has a question.
Yes, hi, excellent study. Thank you very much. I just wanted to ask a couple of things. One is that why did you not include community ethnic media in your study? Because I know that in that area specifically, there are newspapers or news sites that cater and are serving specifically Black and Brown communities, and those are not included in the study. And because those are the outlets that I guess would I would also like to see, because these communities have also been ignored by academia as well. These kinds of studies always focus on traditional outlets, and community ethnic outlets are left out of that equation. So I would like to know that.
Well, I would say one thing about that is we did reach out to a number of outlets that represent the so-called ethnic media, and there was simply no response, essentially. That's not to say that they're not interested, and I think this is a set of questions that absolutely should be raised with ethnic media, but they also service the constituents that we're talking about that feel the gap in the so-called other mainstream media. I don't know, I'm not sure what the term would be, right? So, but that's a good question, and it's certainly something that we were aware of.
Oh, there's another component to it. So we reached out to them. We had a list. We reached out to them. They didn't respond. But then when we looked at their coverage, it was primarily Queens. Was the other reason. So they, again, it almost was like a Westbury, the NASA Illustrated model, where it, has a newspaper in Westbury, but doesn't actually cover Westbury. So there were a number of ethnic media that we looked at, and really it was a handful of media. That there aren't a lot in the area, but there were a handful, and most of the coverage was Queens.
Okay, and also the other thing is, Scott, you pointed out something before. You said in a specific statistic, you said immigration, in how this areas, for example, Hempstead or others, that are 40% immigrants, or and then you only have a couple of stories on immigration, but that's also an assumption that that immigrants only care about immigration stories.
No, we're not. I'm not assuming. I mean, I don't mean to dispute you, but we're not. That's why we had a list there of all the issues within the community that they might care about. I'm just simply raising that as one example of here we're falling down as media, because if you are, if you're an immigrant community, obviously you're going to care about immigration policy and so forth to one degree or another. If you're not addressing that issue in a community where 25 to 40% of that community is foreign born, then we're falling down as we're not providing the information that these people need. Now, that does not to say that that's all they care about, but so we're certainly falling down when it comes to immigration coverage. Among all the other things, LGBTQ was the next on the list. We're at zero coverage.
Not to mention, there have been studies and reports, articles written about how when we do look at immigration, very often it is linked to crime, right? Especially on Long Island, right? When you think of immigration, you think of MS-13, you think of, Trump and others going out to Suffolk County, to Brentwood, and denouncing gang violence, et cetera. And that becomes the immigration frame in which people are looking at it. Again, there's been a lot written about that. That's also highly problematic. A few other questions. I'm not sure how much time we have left. So
yeah, it's okay. I'm willing to stay as long as you need. Did you have another question, Marie?
No, I just wanted to ask if you had looked in your study about collaborative journalism and how maybe these organizations had if there were any examples of that as a model of maybe breaking down those news deserts.
yeah. That's what we're looking to do. That's what we're, in terms of a further future outcome, is looking at ways in that we can do that. And also to get students involved, right? Because I think one of the experiences that we saw, this is a side note, no way to document it, it's more anecdotal. The students who work with us, the graduate research assistants that work with us, who also work with Scott and us on the Long Island Advocate, which is our online hyper-local news site, work at the radio station in terms of doing local coverage, they were really experiencing the importance firsthand by just participating in the study of the need to do community journalism, right? Which, sometimes you come into college to do journalism and you're not thinking of community journalism, you're thinking of, doing something else. And then suddenly you're realizing, wait, this is an essential part of it, and a very important part of it. So that's something we want to do, definitely. And I think our dean's committed to it, the dean's office, our new administration at the university is very much looking for community partnerships. And I think this is something that we're hoping will bear some fruit in the very near future. So that's a great question.
Carl, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, you can hear me. Your study is absolutely superb and fulfills a vital need. Just one small little thing, and this particularly relates to commercial radio. I think deregulation on the federal level is a factor. I mean, I used to take my students from SUNY or Westbury to WGSM radio in Huntington, which was a booming news operation. I used to place interns at WALK in Patchogue. But now with deregulation and ALK and VSM owned by these chains, they've been thrown out of what could be a more diverse and livelier news mix.
Absolutely, there's no question about it. And even to a certain extent, that end of localism in commercial radio, even we see it in some respects in public radio, where the NPR model has become so big that it kind of subsumes and consumes the local aspect of local coverage and limited resources. So that's definitely been a crisis, and there's been a lot written about that as well.
Diane.
I think Robert had Diane,
or Rob. Yeah.
Do you want me to speak or Robert?
Hi, Diane.
Hi, how are you? I can wait for Robert.
Yeah,
Go
go
ahead.
ahead. Diane.
Diane, you're on.
Oh, thank you. First of all, congratulations. Thank you for this study. I'm glad that I was able to participate and to see the presentation this time around since I wasn't able to last time. So it's really impactful. And I just wanted to comment on two questions, well, the question about the business model and the question about collaborative journalism. Because as a public media executive working on, public media on Long Island, we do have, limited resources as do so many other local, institutions. And one of the things that we've found to be really successful, and I think is important and a potential model, is collaborative journalism. We out in Suffolk County, we have a radio station, and it's an NPR FM station, and we've teamed up with the local, hyper local newspapers out there across the East End, and work together with journalists from all the different newspapers every week to produce an hour-long news and public affairs show. And it's really lifted all boats because we're able to really have community conversations about all kinds of things that are important, and highlight the work of so many local journalists in these tiny little local papers. And it's been very successful. We've been doing it for 2 years. And now we're doing community conversations twice a month at different locations around the East End as a result of this collaboration. And, competitors in the news business are friendly competitors these days because we have to be. And it's worked out really well. And I think that that's a model for the future and a way that we can all work together to try to sustain and local journalism, which we all know is, so, as we've seen, so very vitally important.
Mhm.
Well, thank you for that, because that's actually what we've been looking at and sort of looking ahead. So part of the reason that we did the study is because we wanted to look at what works. And I think that increasingly what you're seeing around the country is cooperation is much better than competition, because we're killing each other. At the same time that the market is killing us, the idea of competition amongst ourselves is killing each other. But, a regional daily, a regional news station does not have the bandwidth to cover a community, cover communities one at a time to really give people the information that they really need. But partnering with community news organizations sustains the base of the the media ecosystem, and then nurtures everything else. And then it's a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship because they both benefit. The larger news organization gives the community outlet the exposure that it really needs for people to be more aware of it. And at the same time, the community media feeds stories to the regional news organization that wouldn't otherwise have that coverage that it needs to sustain itself. So it's definitely working. I mean, I see that every morning, on Morning Joe, on MSNBC, he highlights community newspapers, little tiny community newspapers all over the country. I think that's the greatest thing out there.
Yeah, and I think
sustainability.
I think the Santos story that was broken by that newspaper, that tiny newspaper, and nobody, too bad, none of us, were heard about it, because that's the value of local journalism right there. There's no better story that can talk about the value of local journalism. And if they were able to amplify that story somehow, who knows what the outcome of the election might have been. Maybe it would have been different, maybe it wouldn't have. But being able to partner with a larger or with other news organizations to spread the word and to really serve the community, I think is one way that we can really have an impact to sustain local journalism, which is so vitally important. The program that I was talking about that is on the radio is cut into little bites for social media, and the local public access TV stations asked us to film it on Zoom so they could put it on TV too, because everything's multi-platform. That's the way I think that we can have an impact and really help local journalism to sustain itself.
Absolutely. Robert? Robert? Where's Robert? I don't see Robert. Somebody said Robert?
Says Robert Sean.
Yeah, Robert has his hand up and his mic should be
Oh,
open.
Robert. Okay,
Try Robert.
I see him now.
It's not.
Robert, you there?
I think they left.
All right, I think he lowered his hand. All right, so, we went into overtime. I appreciate everybody staying a little bit longer than we were anticipating, but it was a wonderful conversation. Scott or Mario, do you want to leave us with any final words?
Well, thank you. And yeah, I think it was a good conversation, hearing some of your feedback. I look forward to continuing the conversation because, again, this project, we're hoping to get the report out, at least a preliminary report. But, one of the things I didn't mention, and I don't know, Scott, if I should, but one of the things I dream of, after having been at Hofstra for so long and having been involved in community media for so long, my kind of pipe dream is to perhaps one day create a community media news center at Hofstra that serves both the community and serves the local journalism and the students, obviously, in the community at Hofstra. It might be a pipe dream, but I think that's something that a lot of universities have created and done, and are, again, filling some of these gaps. So I'm not shy to say that that's one of the things that might come out of this down in the long term, But I look forward to working and continuing to collaborate and find ways to kind of move this work forward, because I know all of you are committed to it.
Yeah, I just thank everybody for sitting through our presentation and staying the overtime.
Well, thanks again, everybody. This has been the News Deserts in Our Backyard, presented by the Press Club of Long Island. For more information about events that we have coming up, please visit pcli.org. If you would like to become a member of PCLI, go to spj.org, become a member of the Society of Professional Journalists, and select Press Club of Long Island as your chapter. As I said at the top of the program, we have our annual awards coming up. We do an awards presentation in June, but the time to enter is now. So submit your best work from 2022. It's open to anybody, but if you are a member of the Press Club of Long Island, your first entry is free. So we really encourage you to join for that reason and many other benefits.